Margaret stood in the doorway of her father and Apa's garage, the afternoon sun streaming through the skylight above, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the golden beams. She was 58 years old, wearing the orange safety vest her father had always insisted she put on whenever she helped him with projects out here. It felt right to wear it now, even though he was gone. The garage was exactly as Robert had left it 3 weeks ago. Tools hung neatly on pegboards along the wooden walls. His workbench sat cluttered with half-finished projects, a coffee mug still resting beside a pile of sandpaper. Margaret took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had been putting this off, knowing that sorting through her father and Apa's things would make his absence feel terribly real. Her father had been a carpenter by trade, a man of few words but many kindnesses. After her mother passed away 12 years ago, this garage had become his sanctuary. He would spend hours out here, always tinkering, always building something for someone. Margaret had worried about him being lonely, but he always smiled and said he was exactly where he needed to be. As she walked deeper into the space, her eyes fell on two large shapes in the center of the garage, covered entirely with heavy canvas tarps. She had noticed them before, of course, during her occasional visits, but her father had always waved off her questions. And quat just some old furniture and a possum refinishing for a friend. And quat he would say, changing the subject to ask about her garden or her grandchildren. Margaret approached the first covered shape slowly. The tarp was dusty, clearly undisturbed for quite some time. She grasped the edge of the canvas and pulled it back carefully, revealing not old furniture, but a bed. A complete bed frame, carefully assembled, with a brand new mattress still wrapped in protective plastic. The wood was beautiful, honey-colored oak with delicate carved details along the headboard. Her breath caught, this wasn't an Apa's refinishing work. This was a brand new piece, crafted with extraordinary care. Confused, Margaret moved to the second covered shape and pulled away its tarp as well. Another bed, identical to the first, equally pristine and carefully made. 2 beds, both wrapped and waiting, as if her father had been preparing them for someone. Margaret and Apa's mind raced. Her father had lived alone in his small house. He hadn't and Apa mentioned needing new furniture. She walked around the beds, running her hand along the smooth wood, noting the expert craftsmanship, the attention to every detail. These weren't and Apa's just beds. They were works of love. On the workbench, she noticed a leather journal she had seen her father writing in occasionally. She had assumed it was for tracking projects and expenses. With trembling hands, she opened it. The first entries were indeed about carpentry work. Orders completed, lumber purchased, hours spent. But as she flipped through the pages, the entries changed. They became something else entirely. Letters. Letters her father had written but never sent. And quat dear Sarah. And quat one entry began. Margaret and Apa's heart skipped. Sarah was her younger sister, estranged from the family for nearly 15 years after a bitter argument about their mother and Apa's care. Margaret had tried to bridge the gap over the years, but pride and hurt had kept them apart. She continued reading, her father and Apa's familiar handwriting blurring through her tears. And quat the fuss to try it out, and quat the fuss spoken. I know there and Apa's pain on both sides, but I and Apa's an old man now, and I and Apa's learned that time is the one thing we can and Apa's build more of. I and Apa's making these beds for both of you. Not to choose sides, but to show you that in my heart, there and Apa's room enough for both my daughters. When I and Apa's gone, I hope you and Apaslel both come back here. I hope you and Apaslel see these beds and understand that family Isan and Apa's about who was right or wrong. It and Apa's about showing up, even when it and Apa's hard. And quat Margaret sank onto the edge of one of the beds, the journal clutched to her chest. She read entry after entry. Her father had written about his regrets, about wishing he had done more to bring them back together. He wrote about both his daughters with such tenderness, such understanding of their different strengths and struggles. He described building these beds over 2 years, choosing the wood carefully, designing them to be identical, because both his daughters deserved the same love, the same quality, the same proof that they were valued equally. He had planned to give them as gifts, to create a reason for them to come home, to talk, to remember that they were sisters before they were anything else. But time had run out. A sudden heart attack had taken him before he could finish his plan. Margaret sat there for a long time, the garage silent except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. She thought about her sister, about the stupid argument that had spiraled into years of silence. She couldn't and past even remember who had said what anymore. The details had faded, but the hurt had remained, a dull ache she had learned to live with. She pulled out her phone, staring at it for several minutes. Then, with shaking fingers, she found Sarah and Apost's number. It was still saved, never deleted despite everything. "And quat, Sarah?" "And quat," she said when her sister answered, her voice uncertain. "And quat it, and Apost Margaret." And quat there was a long pause. Margaret could hear her sister breathing on the other end of the line. "And quat fos naposum at dad and Apost garage," and quat Margaret continued softly. "And quat fos found something. I think you need to come see this." And quat 3 days later, Sarah drove up from Arizona. Margaret watched from the garage doorway as her sister got out of her car, looking older, grayer, but unmistakably Sarah. They stood facing each other for a moment, years of hurt and longing suspended between them. "And quat, thank you for calling," and quat Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And quat, why should have called years ago," and quat Margaret replied. She led Sarah into the garage, showed her the covered beds, handed her the journal. They sat side by side on one of the beds their father had made, reading his words together, crying together, laughing sometimes at his observations about both of them that were so accurate it hurt. "And quat, he knew us so well," and quat Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "And quat, even when we couldn't and Apost see past our own stubbornness, he saw who we really were. And quat, he never gave up on us." And quat Margaret added. "And quat, he kept believing we and Apost find our way back to each other." And quat, over the following weeks, the sisters met regularly at their father and Apost's house, sorting through his belongings, sharing memories, carefully healing the wounds that had kept them apart. They decided together what to do with the beds. Sarah took one for her guest room, so that Margaret and her family could visit. Margaret took the other, so that Sarah would always have a place to stay when she came to town. The beds became bridges, physical reminders of their father and Apost's love and his unwavering belief in family. Each time Margaret made up the bed in her home, smoothing the quilts over the oak frame, she thought of her father and Apost's hands crafting each joint, sanding each surface, pouring his hope into the wood. On the first anniversary of their father and Apost's death, Margaret and Sarah met at the old garage. They had decided to turn it into a community workshop, a place where people could learn woodworking, where neighbors could borrow tools, where the spirit of their father and Apost's generosity could continue. They named it and quat Robert and Apost's Place and quat and hung a simple sign made from reclaimed wood. As they stood in the doorway, watching the afternoon sun create the same golden light their father had worked in for so many years, Sarah reached for Margaret and Apost's hand. "And quat, he did change our lives," and quat Sarah said quietly. "And quat, even after he was gone, he showed us what really matters." And quat Margaret squeezed her sister and Apost's hand, feeling the warmth, the connection, the family she had almost lost forever. Her father had been a man of few words, but his final message had been crystal clear. Love Dosen and Apost, give up. Family is worth fighting for. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can leave behind eyes on and Apost in what we say, but in what we build with our own 2 hands, hoping that those who come after us will understand. The garage stood open and welcoming, ready to shelter new projects, new friendships, new connections. And somewhere, Margaret liked to think, her father was smiling, knowing that his daughters had finally come home to each other, guided by the gift he had left under those canvas covers, waiting patiently to be discovered.